So as I think you know, Lily has shared with me your reflection pieces, which I found really exciting to read, full of great details, and pretty well for me exactly what I was hoping would happen, which is you would connect readings in this classroom time with some of your own personal reflections on the world of media and politics and food, and then also with your own internal sense of yourself, with the politics of identity that you carry around with you, or the identity of politics that you carry around with you. Because I think that's very important, particularly when we're trying to get to the ways that humans have agency in the world. It's very important to start understanding one's own agency and one's own relationship with other types of power that are all around us, but that we're often not very present to. Reflection is invaluable when it comes to any kind of academic study, but particularly for something as intersubjective as food, we really need to attend to our own sense of things and how it makes us feel in terms of our intellect and our emotions and our bodies and, yes, our affective beings. So I just wanted to give a couple of, not even feedback, but responses, my own reflections on what some of you have written. I was very excited to see that there was discomfort with politics and that sometimes we are uncomfortable with our own sense of engagement or disengagement with the political worlds around us. One of you wrote that politics has become so complicated and mediatized in recent years, both in the United States and lately in Canada, but also obviously very much so in Australia these days. There's so much attention, and it's being both joked about and analyzed and taken seriously and not taken seriously, that eventually the term politics becomes so loaded that we just don't know what to do with it anymore. We don't know whether it should be taken seriously and studied, or whether it should just be left to die somewhere. Could politics please go away? Of course, it's not going to. But that sense of one's own visceral reaction to the word politics is very important. And then if you extend that to others, if you, at the end of this subject, come away with a stronger sense of politics and food than you had coming into it, that's wonderful. If you start talking with your friends and family and colleagues and coworkers and strangers in the street about the politics of gastronomy, you might want to remember that the word politics and even the word gastronomy carry a lot of weight and baggage, and just as you might have sensed the complexity or the ridiculously of politics, others in the world will be doing the same thing as well. So these reflections that you have should also maybe be extended to the people around you, and give them some space and some credit to either absorb or reject your own ideas about power and food peacefully. But letting it become both macro and micro is very important. I think this is exactly what ecosophy is all about, is recognizing the political moments and the political agencies at all of those scales of interrelationship between humans and other humans, and humans and their food, and humans and their built and natural environments. Politics is everywhere, and pretty well anything could be considered to be a political act, particularly when it's food related. There's also this question of the sense of disempowerment that comes from trying to engage with systems of power. They seem so big and, well, powerful. They seem to be inexorable. They seem to reproduce the conditions for their own success no matter what we do as individuals. And I think being able to know that even our small direct interventions are part of the whole power system. It's not so much about changing it by small acts. It's more about participating within it so as not to be disempowered by it. That is, it being the political systems around you. And when you engage, when you participate, you transform yourself, you transform other things, and most of all, you transform your sense of not being disempowered or a slave to those structures around you. That's why activism, or action anyway, is as important as thinking, making, and doing when it comes to food. One of you had the very clear insight that politics and power is located in almost everything in place and structures, in people, in collective movements, in making decisions, in class, in just the things that we are born into the world with. And the difficulty for many people in power is acknowledging how distributed power really is. It's not just difficult, it's painful, and it's most of all scary, because if it's distributed, then having power may not be such a stable thing for those who currently do. So that's a very important insight, I think. You need to make that distribution of power as gastronome student activists, whatever you become. You need to make it clear that that power is distributed. And I think this is where the politics of gastronomy for me resonates very strongly, because one of my motivations in life and through my academic and artistic work is to make sure that the individual eater senses their own power as much as possible at all times. Because when you sense your power, you can activate it. Again, when you feel like you're a slave to the systems, there's very little that you sense you can do. When you suddenly notice that there's power and agency all around you and not necessarily centralized in the classic bodies that we usually attribute it to, things like doctors and grandmothers and nutritionists and governmental powers and corporate marketers, those are very obvious centers of power, but they're not the only place the power exists. And when you start seeing it as distributed throughout an entire system, it becomes very exciting and very potential laden for those that you want to support in the efforts or the directions that they want to go in. So again, one of the phrases that I very much resonated with in one of your pieces of writing was how much politics happens in common spaces or common experience or common language. And that's both true and very much not true, because common is not necessarily common to everybody. And because of the relative ease of migration around the world, many of us come from many different places and bring those experiences with us to the new context. And so our experience can be very uncommon and very not aligned with what is commonly held in that new space that we're occupying. So a common understanding or a common set of truths, commonly held beliefs, all of these things are places to challenge because we don't necessarily share things as commonly as we expect we do. And that's also a place where privilege can then get itself enacted, and sometimes problematically, because privilege is based in a sense that what you are doing is common or ordinary, not necessarily that you're trying to enact a special power. It's the privilege of ordinariness that can often have a negative impact or an oppressive impact on those who are not from within your common experience. Two little notes that I wanted to put a flag against and just perhaps push back on myself a little are the usage of neoliberal and neoliberalism, as well as what a few of you included, Michael Pollan's idea of voting with one's fork. These are two things that get talked about a lot in the world of food and certainly in gastronomic discourse. And it's worth noting that the notion of neoliberalism has been around for a very long time, a century or so, and that it is based on even 19th century ideas about economic reform or economic stability and the ways that economics should be allowed to play themselves out, as well as how humans should or should not intervene in economics, even though economics is largely a construct of humans. But then, of course, it moves on to being its own thing, its own assemblage of multiple ecologies. But so neoliberal, although we use it very, very much in the contemporary context, has been something that's been around in multiple forms of discourse for a good 100 years, and has been mutating and has been changing to mean different things in response to different political contexts. So that's another story, that's another history of things. But to have a sense of neoliberal as having evolved over time, having not been constant, having been a term that's used to describe many different situations of social, political, and economic behavior, all those things should be understood when the word is deployed in text. And then the Michael Pollan quote, "Vote with your fork," it has a very strong ring of truth to it. And then to me, it's also very neoliberal in the 2019 sense. That is, we don't really vote with our forks. We do stuff when we eat. We engage and participate in broad systems of food production and consumption. But voting is a distinctive act that I think should be reserved for voting, where one mark means one person's contribution to a very quantified outcome. And voting with your fork is it's bringing together a lot of messy stuff, joyously messy stuff to do with food, and this idea of quantifying behaviors and the outcomes that they produce in the world, or the collective results of a bunch of people doing a single act. I'm not a big fan of pollen anyway, but that particular term always rubbed me the wrong way because it is very much a consumerist economic contribution to the world that is also not quite right in terms of how complex gastronomy is and how many different elements are producing the outcomes that we sometimes think we may have produced just by voting with our fork. Also, fork forgets about all the other lovely implements there are to vote with, like spoons and chopsticks and fingers and other people's hands. So that's a little bit of lightness, but it's also something to pay attention to. Keep using the term if you love it, but also be aware of all of the different pieces that it encompasses. So again, in reading through one of your pieces, I'm very attracted to the comment that one of you made about how politics and political become shorthand for things are just getting too complicated, or things are getting so complicated that we might as well not try to involve ourselves in them. It's getting meaningless at a certain point. And it's also maybe getting pointless to try to intervene because it's become political. And I think this is a very important insight, is that maybe when it becomes political, that's exactly when we should be intervening or trying to get ourselves involved, rather than stepping back and saying, it's just turned into a mess now. Well, yeah, mess is definitely something you should engage with. My last comment is towards one of you who reminded me very helpfully about Guattari's call for the importance of turning to ethico-aesthetic inspiration and action in engaging ecosophically in the world. And that so much has become scientized or technologized with an aim to solving the world's problems, that the aesthetic or the creative, maybe the affective, these are places to participate in, these are ways to participate, because they're often forgotten in our objectives to make the world better. And yet it is very much through ethics and through aesthetics, through care and sharing and attention to the interpersonal relationship, attention maybe to affect as well, that perhaps some of the positive that we're trying to enact in the world can come about. And I was very glad that you reminded me of this, because it's easy to talk about politics and power and technologies and framing systems and built environment and all the hard stuff of the world when we're trying to figure out what's wrong or what's fixable in gastronomy, and forget about the poetics and the delight and the joy and the aesthetics and the sensoriality of what food very much is, and how the three registers of Guattari's ecosophy all contain different ethico-aesthetic moments that can be paid attention to, that can become the points of articulation between those three registers, that can become our opportunities for making ecosophy a real-world practice, and for making gastronomy a real-world space of generosity and giving and positivity. Affect. How you affect me. Affect, you delight me. You open my mind, my spirit, my soul to so many possibilities when it comes to gastronomy. Affect. Well, so those might be my feelings expressed through emotions about my ideas about affect. But they're not really an affective response to affect, which might be more like, or, or, affect, as Lily has probably described to you, is that pre-personal vibe that you might get when walking into a room full of strangers or family members who have just been involved in something and you don't know exactly what, but you sense something is taking place in the room. And it's very, very hard to put into words as well, because if you look at that Xiao's article where he discusses feeling, emotion, and affect, affect is, for him anyway, pre-personal. It's an intensity that one feels, that one has in the physiology, psychology, emotional, limbic systems, but it precedes our socialization as human beings in some ways. This is his perspective anyway. And so part of our socialization as human beings is being able to put things into words and describe them and explain them. And so in some ways, affect, if it's pre-personal, is also pre-language and pre-anything. Maybe not pre-gesture, because even before we become our human selves, there's some kind of gesture, movement, motion that goes on with living things, with zygotes and fetuses and whatever it is that we are in between those things. So affect for me is a kind of important space to, again, not necessarily understand or define, but sense and feel as part of the world of gastronomy, and certainly potentially as the world of politics as well, and power and the way that those relate. So why? Well, because I feel like there's something unaccounted for in our understanding of food, food systems, food context, food milieus, food cultures, food politics. We can scientize the material of it. We can understand the culture and the anthropology to a certain extent of it. We can parse the sociological and economic frameworks of it. But what is it about food that just renders it so intensely intense? And to me, that is a space that might be occupied by affect. In astronomy, well, astronomers and cosmologists talk about dark matter, that unaccounted for large mass in the universe which doesn't emit any light. Scientists here on Earth cannot see dark matter because it's dark. It's not emitting anything that they can pick up on, register, measure, and then make projections about. To me, in some ways, the dark matter of gastronomy is affect. It's the stuff that is there that produces an effect and yet is so hard to quantify, qualify, or even describe and understand. So let's look at some examples of affect, or perhaps what is affect, within gastronomy and see if it helps clarify why it might be an important concept. So you walk into a restaurant and it just doesn't feel right. You just don't want to eat there. Is it the smell? Is it the lighting? Is it the furniture? Is it the way you were greeted at the door by the person who's there? Is it the space itself? Is it the built environment? Is it all those non-living things that seem to create an energy, or again, if we want to use the word, a vibe in the space, but that somehow turns you off, that you get a bad feeling, you think something's not going to be right? Well, it could be any one of those more measurable variables. It might be something to do with affect. Certainly there's been a lot of writing on how space and the built environment can help to shape specific behaviors or interactions, but also perhaps start to contribute to our affective responses within those spaces. Is it tangible? No. Can you absolutely quantify it? No. Can you say it's universal for all the people who walk in there? No. But it does often seem to be very powerful that space produces a kind of affective response. So if you're talking about, how do you make a good restaurant design, that may be in there. And the only way to sort of not measure it, but test it, is to bring people in and see what their affective responses are. Affect does seem to produce physiological responses in the body. The heart rate can accelerate or decelerate, breathing as well, blood vessels contract or expand. And so some of these reactions seem to be the reactions that happen when the whole corpus needs to actually do something like run away or fight or relax. So maybe affect is an important indicator for what sort of security there is in the space, or what comforts or what powers are at play. But then if you think about other spaces where food happens, gardens and fields, as well as factories, as well as farm markets, as well as all of those production and consumption, retail, distribution, transformation spaces where food is going on, if they are also shaped by certain built environment elements, architecture and space, as well as atmospherics, light and sound, which are also in some ways produced by the space, can have a very powerful effect on the way we sense the space without necessarily being able to put it into words, maybe the way that we are affectively responding to it. So all of those places are shaped by those conditions and therefore produce through the collective agencies of those elements some kind of responses, some of which might be affective, some of which therefore might be very important to try to pay attention to. How explicitly? Not entirely sure, but there's an example. There is I'm not sure how well known it is, but I've been told it's well known. There's been some research done on what is called the Provençal rosé paradox. And this is, in shorthand, is the effect that happens when you go to the south of France, sit at a beautiful terrace, have a glass of exquisite Provençal rosé wine, and then buy a case of it and bring it home and drink it in your apartment in London, and no longer think it tastes very good, and in fact think it's kind of horrible. And so the question is, why is that happening? What's within that paradox? Why did it taste so good in Provence and so terrible? It was ostensibly the same wine. And the answer might be affect. The answer might be that all of those atmospherics, not just your emotional, psychological state of being on vacation in Provence, but all of those atmospherics that are surrounding you when you're in Provence having the rosé wine, the context or the milieu, are producing an affective response to the wine that goes beyond its measurable sensorial properties, and that goes beyond its maybe less measurable discursive properties, that is the story that got told about it, or the shape of the bottle, or the description on the wine bottle, or the description by the waiter. Goes beyond all that, and it's just, that feels good. And then you get home and it's like, that feels sour or sweet or boring or flaccid. And that might be the case. The Hayes-Conroy sisters have written about olive oil and affective responses to olive oil in terms of producing engagement with the slow food movement. And the sort of very quick synopsis of one of the articles that I read is olive oil tastings as held by slow food as a way to engage people on the importance of high-quality food, but also producer well-being and maintenance of tradition and small-scale industry. If there's an affective response to the olive oil, that might then get translated to slow food as well and create, by association, an affective negative response to the motivations and mission of Slow Food International. That's what part of their thesis is about. They talk about the viscerality or the non-viscerality of tasting olive oil and how that might produce in some larger context, that is one's engagement and interest in food activism, that might produce some resistance or engagement or excitement or negativity. Moving more towards some potentially more out there examples, or less provable, but potentially interesting. I've been very interested in how the microbiome, the human microbiome, if we can call it human, how that may be part of the whole affective response system. Specifically, if in some way the gut flora that we cohabitate with, all of our bacteria and viruses and yeast cells that are activating us as human beings when we digest and in other ways as well. If those are somehow involved in affective responses, if that very, very vast network of small creatures is interacting perhaps with another person or another thing's vast network of small creatures, and we don't know how to measure that, because of course measuring the microbiome is extremely difficult, or perhaps impossible. There are too many beings, there are too much in flux and in dynamic reproduction and decay constantly. But if somehow the microbiome is involved in our affective response, and if somehow we are consuming less and less microbially biodiverse foods because of industrialization, because of less and less home fermenting and home baking and home brewing and home cheese making, if we are involved in our microbiomes less, if we are nurturing them less, if we are in some ways damaging them more with all of the environmental toxins and antibiotics and other elements that we are bringing into our worlds in order to reduce harmful pathogens, but also obviously reducing all microbial life forms. If we're doing that, if we're reducing the biodiversity of our microbiome, if we're reducing its complexity, if we're stabilizing other food things and reducing their microbial complexity, and if those things can't talk to each other anymore, those two sets of microbiomes, then maybe there's some kind of lack of communication going on that we don't really know how to quantify or qualify. Is effectively the consumption of sliced white bread reducing human social connectivity because we're reducing the complexity and diversity of our microbiome? Is that an affective related condition? Is affect related to our microbiome? But then this also gets into what might be microbial, it might be something else, and that's the performativity of food, or the non-human agency of food, the non-living agency of some foods that have been stabilized and deadened. Maybe they still have some sort of presence or energy or activity about them that produces in us an affective response that is, again, hard to know where it's coming from, how to measure it, how to describe it, but it's doing something. And if it's doing something, maybe that's the non-human agency of food. It's not intentionality, but it is the capacity to bring about change, the capacity to act, or the capacity to produce a reaction in others. So again, affect might be important when we're talking about performance and performativity, because it's not specifically about the language or movement or materiality of the thing that's performing, but how it produces in that performance an effective response. And so that's, again, just a question to consider. Is that intensity which cannot be named, literally our gut reaction to something, is that so important in how we respond to food, how we think and feel food, but also impossible to measure or know absolutely through our current tools of understanding? I don't know. But to me, that's why affect gets really exciting when it comes to food, when it comes to gastronomy, and then when it comes to the very sometimes visceral effects that politics and power play in our social and individual lives. So now is the time that we process the process and practice the practice. I'm not sure what that means, but I am glad that you have collectively pushed back on my rather brief introduction to the difference in relationship between process and practice. I had not intended to raise it last week, and then suddenly it came out. It is a subject that I find kind of fascinating and could spend a lot of time on, so here we'll spend a little bit of time on it now. I think for gastronomy, it's a useful differentiation to start to understand, certainly for ecosophy as well, and I'll get to that at the end of this segment. But scrolling back a little bit, I have often in my work talked about food as being composed of, or at its nature, a combination or an assemblage of matter, discourse, and process. And in fact, it's so assembled that those three things can't really be separated in some ways. So the example is classically the banana. A banana is very materially a yellowish, sometimes red, sometimes green fruit that has materiality, that can be eaten, that has a lot of sensorial properties. It is a material thing that is also deeply wrapped up in the discourse of banana-ness. That is, the word banana to begin with, but then the whole discourse of what a banana is, how it fits in the world, how it can be turned into an ice cream treat, how it can be eaten by itself, how it can be peeled, how someone can slip on the skin and then make a joke about it. So the storying of banana is very much part of its nature. But then in terms of process, there is no banana without a banana tree, without sunlight and micronutrients and soil creating the possibility for that tree to grow and produce fruit. And then that fruit has to be harvested. And even the act of peeling the banana or slipping on that banana peel afterwards is all part of the process that is involved in making a banana, or making banana part of the world of banana-ness. So in that sense, there cannot be banana as we know it without matter, discourse, and process. And so as I started to spend time using that as a kind of foundation for my understanding of gastronomy and food milieus in general, I started wondering, well, what is process? Is process the act of peeling a banana with your hand, or is process the abstract notion that banana might be peeled with something and that human hand is a way to do it? But in the same way that affect is pre-personal, I find process to be pre-material and pre-discursive. Process is the, dare I say, the purified form of movement or gesture. It's the script that has never been written down that describes how something might happen. And then when process and matter and discourse, or process and matter, process and discourse come together, that turns into what I would call practice. So if matter and process are together, that's material practice. That's making a painting. That's cooking a risotto. That's fermenting kombucha. Then if discourse and process are combined, that might be discursive practice. That's talking or writing or conceptualizing in words, or making graphic representations of things that contribute to its discursive reality. So again, it's a little bit abstract, but for me, practice is when action gets put together with something that makes a change in the world. And so this might be important. I think it is, because it helps also understand how, for example, a recipe is not substantial in itself. A recipe as process, that is, before it's written down or put in a cookbook, before it's searched on the internet, before it's enacted by a cook in front of his or her stovetop, before all that happens, recipe in its, again, dare I say it, purified form, is the process of making food. Recipe is the abstract coming together of things before they actually come together. And that can be important when you're starting to understand what a recipe is. But what is tradition? What is a traditional recipe? These things are often talked about with great importance in gastronomic writing and discourse and argument. What is the original version of pasta puttanesca? What is the authentic Thai curry? What is this or that? And if you imagine that process is very abstract, but practice, real time, real space, material, discursive engagement, doing, making, then that's always going to be unique in the moment. And then, for example, there is no authentic anything, because authentic only exists in that real time, real space moment. The first one was maybe the first one, but it doesn't make it the authentic one. It just makes it one in a series of practical enactments, practices. If there were such a thing that could be understood and written about and talked about as process in its pure abstract form, that might get to the authentic. But in the real existence of humans, there is no such thing as pure process, because we can't actually get there without describing it. And once you've described it, you've enacted some kind of discursive practice. So it's a philosophical, maybe metaphysical, maybe even affective notion. It's something that is very hard to separate from the day-to-day, and yet it's very already combined in the day-to-day. There is no day-to-day process because it's actually already been turned into practice because it's in the day-to-day. In other ways, other examples that this might be useful, I had an old physics professor, or I had a physics professor many years ago, who was teaching us about electronics, about semiconductors. And he was trying to explain to us what was happening at the atomic level within a transistor. A transistor is a small electronic switch. It's a very important thing. It replaced vacuum tubes and things like radios and broadcast mechanisms, and it allowed for very, very small radios to be created, which was very important at a moment in history. Still is important. But the transistor that has led on to other kinds of semiconductors, including those that are in our computers and that basically run the entire world. So the semiconductor is a very, very important thing because it can turn on and off an electric current. It can make present an electric charge, so it can be a 1 or a 0, basically. And that's why transistors and semiconductors are very important. At the atomic level, they're quite hard to understand. And even though I was in a program that was about understanding this, we got really stuck. And the professor eventually said, well, you know what? It doesn't really matter. You don't need to know what's going on inside the transistor. You just need to know what happens when you put a transistor in a circuit and how that affects the circuit, and then what that circuit can do because you've got a transistor in it. That's the macro level of understanding the transistor, he said. And he said the even more macro level way of understanding it is, I don't need to understand how my car engine works in order to be able to drive my car. I get in it, I turn the ignition, I put my foot on the accelerator, and I do a few other things, and my car goes down the street. And I don't need to know what's going on inside the camshaft or the combustion chamber or the cylinders or all those other bits of a car that probably don't exist because it's been replaced by computers, but used to exist and used to be part of some people's understanding, but not everyone's understanding who ever drove a car. Okay, so that's how I get to the importance of process. You don't really need to understand exactly how something is happening in order to put it into practice in the real world. But if you know that at that atomic level or inside the car engine, there are processes going on that have been designed that do have a kind of elemental purified form, then it helps you understand maybe what's going on when something goes wrong, or maybe what questions you need to ask when something goes wrong with that transistor or with that car engine. One example that has come up in my own life recently is the commons. The commons is being talked about increasingly in a lot of food circles. Certainly the commons of gastronomy is something that has been discussed at William Angliss and in other places in the world. And the commons is having a resurgence as an important notion. Lily can tell you more about the history of the commons if she wants to. But my parents work within a commons community on the west coast of Canada. And it is a piece of land, and it's a group of people, and it's many buildings, and it's a lot of different material and discursive practices. There are a huge number of meetings at which people talk and talk and talk and take notes and write things. There's a website. There's a set of values. There's a mission statement. There's a covenant, which is effectively a contractual means for protecting this land in perpetuity for the use by the people of the island on which my parents live. And the commons is a functioning, real-world place full of different practices that are about gardening and decision-making and installing irrigation systems and writing covenants that protect land and all these things. At the heart of the commons is a bunch of processes that the people there have agreed to enact together. And because you have to when you're talking about something like a common piece of land that is for use by the people, for the good of the people, in a fairly noble and abstract and brave kind of way. When you create all those processes, you have to discuss them, discuss them, discuss them to try to get them right. But then when you put them into practice, when you actually go and do the gardening or make decisions about who's allowed to be on that common site and who isn't, practice starts to reveal how process is not perfect. Process is an ideal or an imagined way of doing things. But it's not the way that things necessarily roll out in real life. And if you come back to the recipe, same thing. Even a printed recipe enacted by a cook at a stove doesn't always come out the same way. In fact, it never comes out the same way. Even if it comes out very similarly, it's always a little bit different because in practice, process is not real. Process is idealized. Process is abstracted. Process is the best or the imagined truth of the way that things happen. But practice is actually what happens in the world. And so, again, is this useful? It's been useful for me in different ways to think about different subjects that I want to study, to understand how sometimes things break down, or sometimes things happen serendipitously in fantastic ways that you never imagined. And again, that's where process and practice are different. The practice was better than the process that was originally envisioned. I think for ecosophy, process and practice come in because ecosophy is in some ways the process that Guattari abstractly and idealistically imagines for the interaction between the three different ecological registers. And those points of articulation, as I talk about them, are imagined spots where other processes can be enacted in order to make better in the world. That's the process of ecosophy. But for this course, for all of you, for me, ecosophy has to become a practice and not just an idealized version of things in a 22-page text that describes them. Process of ecosophy becomes practice, I think, by paying attention to those points of articulation where strange things might be happening or power might be transferring or not transferring from one agent to another. Paying attention to those points and then intervening at the appropriate moment, being attentive and active, for me, is the way that ecosophy as process becomes ecosophy as practice. And so that's where the difference is important, because it makes us say, oh yeah, there's still something missing. There's engagement, there's material, there's discourse. Let's do something. Let's do something with attention. Let's do it with reflexivity. Let's do it with care and concern for other bodies that are present in that moment that we're trying to intervene upon. And by bringing all of those things together, ecosophy as process becomes ecosophy as practice. So for this last segment, I have returned to my office. I'm sitting in front of my desk. My computer is now propped up on a couple of thick encyclopedias. I'm sitting on a hard chair, and I am speaking very firmly into the camera. And it may make you wonder, what is different about this segment than all the others? Well, before I was kneeling on the ground on a little bench in front of different interesting backdrops, but you could see that I was close to the ground. And then in the commentary on your reflections, I was sitting jauntily on the back of my sofa while the computer was balanced on a pillow, so there might have been some jiggles as my knee bumped against that pillow. And each of those was to present a different kind of visual affect to you. Dare I say it? What was the result? Did it have any effect on the way you perceived what I was saying? Just something to reflect on as we go into this more didactic part of this particular video. And Lily has asked me to discuss the essay, to unpack some of the questions that I posed to you in that essay assignment, and to maybe help you figure out how to get a start on this essay, since it is worth a fair amount of your mark, and it's a fairly brief question that can lead to a fairly complex understanding of the milieu that you choose to write about. So in this assignment, you are to pick a given gastronomic milieu, and that's my term for a space that maybe involves a number of different elements of different ecological registers. So there might be people, there might be individuals with subjective interpretations of themselves. There might be people interacting with other people in a social manner. And there may be people and food and other living and non-living things with agency in a larger environment that maybe embeds these different human actors as well as presents the challenge that you've chosen to identify. And that challenge can be anything. It can be a spot where you see something not so positive going on in the world of agriculture or processing or distribution, retailing, consumption, cultural exchange, political maneuverings, all. Any of those are ripe for unpacking and teasing apart. And what I will hope you'll do is, maybe as a starting point for this exercise, is to, before you start writing, construct a mind map or a concept map or an ecological map of the challenge that you've identified that you want to understand better. And from there, identify some of the individual actors, the people, the things, the language, the material objects, the flows of power, the relationships, the ways that different actors are both dominated by and nurturing of other actors within that ecology, within that context that you've chosen. And map those out and draw lines on the paper and make connections and arrowheads and all these things where you see relationships taking place. If there's a relationship, there's probably some amount of power at play. And if you can start mapping that out, you can start seeing where different actors are influenced by other actors and how those influences produce, perhaps, or contribute to the challenge that you're trying to analyze and that you're thinking about in depth. So in this assignment, you are, through writing, through thinking and writing, to critically analyze the political tensions within this challenge that you've identified and that you want to think and write about. And by political tensions, I mean those moments when two actors or agencies or humans or bodies or spaces, two different elements of that context, are perhaps creating power dynamics between themselves that are not necessarily easy and that are maybe counterintuitive. And by that I mean sometimes one actor can both be dominating of and nurturing of another actor at the same time, and vice versa. So if there is some kind of flow back and forth of different kinds of power between those two actors, that can create some sort of tension. And that tension may be, it may not be, but it may be part of the source of the challenge that you've identified. And it may also be part of the reason that that challenge has arisen and is hard to, what I've said, resolve or refigure. It's hard to remediate that challenge, fix it, or maybe even intervene within that challenge because of those power relationships between the actors that you've now just mapped out. This is what you're trying to figure out through this essay. It's not just a presentation of facts, it's a real questioning. And so this is where the reflexivity part comes in again. You need to insert yourself in some imaginary way into that context or challenge that you've identified and look around and be the ecosophic investigator to try to see where the points of articulation are between ecological registers. How can you put ecosophy as process into practice by projecting yourself into that situation and then potentially proposing how your participation or another person's participation could rectify, could respond to the challenge, could potentially resolve the power dynamics or power imbalances or power need for power redistribution within that context. The philosopher Gaston Bachelard has once said something to the effect that systems of power tend to reproduce the conditions for their own success. And if you look at any large corporation or institution or university, very often the patterns and processes and practices of doing, of making things happen within those institutions, reproduce the conditions that allow those institutions to continue to thrive. Certainly, corporations, if they are, say, a food corporation that is trying to sell new products, will very often do market research, but frame that market research in such a way as to create responses, consumer responses or consumer insights that will support the direction that they already wanted to go. That is a habit of a lot of kinds of research in general, but also a lot of kinds of consumer research. And so consumer triggers or consumer needs or perceived need states of consumers are the ways that that research gets framed. And then the outcome of that research is just more consumer needs or consumer need states, which then support the development of products that satisfy those need states, but also probably contribute to those need states perpetuating themselves. Even such things as, afternoon snacks as a concept is fraught with power, because an afternoon snack is embedded between two other meals, maybe, is embedded within systems of work in which an afternoon snack becomes necessary. Maybe that's an office context where it's so boring that you need to take a break to go eat some pretzels at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, or drink coffee because you have lost your attention span and you need to revitalize your brain. Or you have a collective kitchen where people are sharing things but also keeping their own food to themselves, and so that becomes a negotiation space itself of sharing or of non-sharing of food. And that notion of a morning or afternoon snack that the food company has come up with is now inserted into that already dynamic, tension-filled space of the break room at the corporate headquarters. And so even there, it's reinforcing a sort of sense of human behavior that may have been raised in the original market research. So this is a convoluted way of saying that systems of power support their own existence. And so if you're going to try to intervene in them or rectify them or respond to them or resolve them, seeing those patterns, seeing how one part of the political structure of that challenge or that context influences, shapes, drives behaviors in other parts of that assembled state or that ecology. And then that outcome of that influenced behavior then goes back and cycles around and around and around. You get to a kind of whirlpool or cyclical response and feedback and instigation, and all of this just cycles around to turn itself into an unchangeable or a seemingly unchangeable situation. That's what this essay is trying to undo, is that there is a system of power at play that cannot be undone in this challenge, and if you analyze it through ecosophy, maybe you will start to see a point where intervention could have an effect on it, disrupt the power, change the situation, and again, we all hope for the better. And then if you've analyzed that through the formal process of essay writing, maybe when you're finished with being a gastronome or being a gastronomic student, you go out and continue to enact that in the day-to-day in a kind of ecosophic practice that doesn't necessarily involve essay writing, but that has now become part of your set of tools that you know how to use really well. And so you can be responsive and reactive in real time and produce good in the world, produce value, either the kind that you want to produce or the kind that you want others to produce. So I will give a couple of examples that I've just scratched out on a piece of paper here to give an illustration maybe of what I mean by the challenge or the milieu or the context that you're trying to identify. So recently I met a woman who was trying to use digital technology to facilitate the production of an intergenerational cookbook. And she thought that because she had come up with this brilliant technocratic solution, suddenly grandmother's recipes would be shared with the world, and a lot of cultural heritage would be preserved, and it was going to be a good thing. And I thought, that seems a little challenging. And I pushed back on her because I said there are a lot of what I think of as false assumptions within her solution that are maybe going to reproduce the same problematic situation of intergenerational knowledge not being transferred along. And there were just a few things. So a few of the elements in the ecosophic map that I would have drawn out are the notion of grandmother's advice, the act of sharing or not sharing recipes, because historically the recipe, when it's not written down, remains a source of power for an individual. And because women have historically often not had as much evident power as men, that the holding onto of recipes by the grandmother was an act of retention of power, and that when she finally allowed her daughters or her granddaughters to have those recipes, to understand not just how they exist as abstract processes, but as real practices in the world, that was a giving up of power. And that would be something that would be done very late in the life of the grandmother. Now I'm using grandmother and mother and daughter very self-consciously. Historically, it was more often women who were transferring that kind of knowledge, and it wasn't through written recipes, and it wasn't through digital platforms either. It was through side-by-side cooking. It was through the performance of a recipe in the kitchen in real time, not the handing off of a text. Now, the text might have been written down at some point as a reminder, but very rarely would that text absolutely represent what was going on in the kitchen. So, once that power is given up, it's a transfer of a role of the woman, generally, who has held on to that power historically, and now it's transferring that role and that power to the next person. But this also builds in the invisibility of reproductive and domestic knowledge, the reproductive and domestic work that women historically have largely been responsible for, but that has generally been ignored as valuable and as powerful, or as a site of power in the history of humanity. So, invisibility of work, the transmission of knowledge through performance, not through text, the giving of power, the whole gendering of food work in general, all of those become complexified for me when it gets proposed that someone should use digital technology to save recipes because grandma can just type them down into her computer. Well, there's a lot of false assumptions in that. So that's a very straightforward kind of domestic, media-oriented food challenge that I would have identified and parsed in that very, very beginning way. That example would need a lot more work. But one that I just heard about on the radio recently, equally troubling and equally interesting and equally digital in nature, was about a guy who has developed, for Canada anyway, a new mobile app called Flash Food, which people can download. And then a number of supermarket chains here in Canada are participating. And this is all with the objective of reducing supermarket food waste, which, as we know, is quite substantial. There's a lot of perfectly edible food that's thrown out, not put back into different circuits in a city because the supermarkets are, well, worried about people becoming poisoned by their day-old bread or their milk that is just past the, not the expiry date, but the best before date. Those are two different things, which Lily can explain to you. But this app is meant to be used by people who want to get, for example, 50% off a given grocery item because they're buying it at the last minute through this app. And this is meant to reduce that terrible issue of food waste at the supermarket level. So what's built into this? Well, digital technologies, mobile devices, access to the time and the ability to get to a grocery store at a moment's notice and pick up the thing that you just purchased on your app. So that assumes that you have a certain amount of freedom within your schedule to go shopping on the day that you weren't necessarily planning to go shopping on. There's also this whole question of food banks. As supermarkets have become aware of the waste that they're producing in the world, and as activists get aware of that as well and create systems for moving almost wasted food into food banks, this app could be actually redirecting that food that would be going to the food bank into consumers' hands and making it a for-profit transaction rather than a for social value transaction. Of course, food banks sometimes take fresh food and then it sits in their warehouses and rots because it hasn't been able to be delivered into the hands of eaters. So a lot of stuff in there, but also the rhetoric of waste and the perception that consumers and supermarkets are largely responsible for waste, whereas in fact there's a great deal of waste that's taking place throughout the food chain, and that whole piece of the waste rhetoric is being ignored within this particular digital app. So in this supposed solution to a very real challenge, that is food waste, there's a whole lot of assumptions, again, that are being made and a whole number of pieces of the ecological register that are being left out. So what can be mapped back into this particular challenge, and what solutions or responses might be found that are potentially more socially just, more collectively valuable and more ecosophic than the developers of flash food might be about to realize. And then the last thing I will say with my professorial hat on is do good reading. Find useful quotations, concepts, and abstractions from the literature in gastronomy. Draw on your own reflexive writing. Draw on popular writing about some of these issues, where indeed you might be drawing the challenges from. And use as many different tools that are at your disposal, including non-text tools, to illustrate your analysis of this situation. If gastronomy is to become some sort of successful model for intellectually and physically and emotionally and effectively behaving in the world, then you will need to use all the resources that are available to you and not just words in order to make that change happen. So this essay is also another step, another piece of practice in getting towards that more masterful use of all of the tools that are available to you when it comes to doing good work in the world.